Thank you very much. It is truly a privilege to be here at this first Research Summit series. I am really looking forward to the entire evening. As all of you have seen, it's an exciting program and agenda, and I am looking forward to, I both get to spend some time with some lovely old friends, and I'm sure make many new friends here as well. So I'm going to talk about aging, society, and happiness, which, as you might guess just from the title, is filled with complexity, both in terms of concepts as well as data. It is interesting that the vice rector started out by saying how important it is for us to keep moving into the future. Science has really, for decades, has really focused on very concrete entities. And even, just 5 years ago, no one would have considered happiness to be part of science. Maybe a little, social psychology, but not science and medicine. So I think it's actually particularly fitting to start off today thinking about really new concepts in terms of what is science and health, and really the very recent advances we've been making in recognizing concepts like happiness and psychological well-being as critical parts of science and health. So just to get us started with a picture of what is happiness, health, and aging, this is an older man, I think somewhere in Los Angeles. And just in case you can't see all the details, besides his orange convertible, his bumper sticker says 70, the new 40, and his license plate says live for fun. So this is our goal right here. I'm just starting out giving you a picture of it. And now we'll move a little bit into the science. So, as I said, the notion of sort of positive well-being, being part of health, has become, it's been around for a while, but its focus is relatively new. And it does actually exist in all sorts of constructs. That is one piece of the complexity. We say a word like happiness or well-being, and I think it doesn't take much thought for us to realize it's actually hard to define and operationalize. So I just wanted to start out giving you a list of several of the different concepts that have been posed as measures of positive well-being. And they're items ranging from things like purpose in life, self-acceptance, even just the word happiness, that people consider themselves happy, satisfaction with life. I have at the bottom here, though, optimism. In fact, although most of these concepts have been studied in one way or another, currently optimism has actually been the largest focus so far of health research. Optimism is generally the expectation of positive outcomes. So I'm going to focus mostly this evening on optimism as a way to maintain health and well-being. So just to define optimism a little more formally, there is actually a formal measure of optimism. It's called the Life Orientation Test. It can standardly be administered in a relatively brief survey and includes 6 items. So in order to assess a person's optimism, it's based on these 6 items. So in uncertain times, I usually expect the best. If something can go wrong with me, it will. I'm always optimistic about my future. I hardly ever expect things to go my way. I rarely count on good things happening to me. Overall, I expect more good things to happen to me than bad. So for each of these 6 items, people are given 5 responses, ranging from disagree strongly to agree strongly, where disagree strongly is given a score of 0, and and agrees strongly is given a score of 4. As you notice, the questions do go a bit in reverse order. Sometimes they're posed positively and sometimes they're posed negatively. So in the scoring, those 0 to 4s, just get reversed. So that you end up with a scale that ranges from 0 to 24. With 0 being sort of pessimistic or the least optimistic, and 24 being the most optimistic. But you do, get a nice range in there of different levels of optimism. And I'm sure you can't sort of memorize these items, but maybe each of you can do a quick calculation of what your own level of optimism is. So this is sort of one more cartoon. Oh, how did I do that? Make it big again. Oh. Okay. So, as I said, science has thought for a long time about health in aging. But this is a kind of a cartoon about how we maybe more standardly think of it. So this clearly is an older man, who has certainly survived to age, but's not doing very well. And his physician's saying to him, "Remember the 20 extra years you added to your life through clean, healthy living? Well, these are them." And I think this is exactly what all of us want to avoid. And I think some of the focus now on well-being, on assets like optimism, is the way we've developed, to avoid this picture. And, maybe think back to that other older man at the beginning who clearly had, not just long life, but happiness and well-being. So now I am going to move into some of the science. This is kind of a general picture of how we think about the influence of optimism on health, and it truly is multifaceted. So at the top, we have optimism. Certainly one way that optimism may impact both our health and well-being is by decreasing levels of stress, but there's many, many other aspects to it. So optimism can both positively influence what I'll call restorative processes and also decrease deteriorative process. So at the same time, it may improve our health behaviors. So in the positive sense of health behaviors being restorative are things like optimistic people may exercise more, have a healthier diet. Those are all positive health behaviors. At the same time, optimism could decrease some of the bad health behaviors like cigarette smoking. And I'm actually going to show you as we go along evidence of all of these items. But it's not just health behaviors. There is evidence as well that optimism truly has biologic impact. And again, in both positive and negative ways, so that optimism may enhance positive biologic function. So if we think of some positive biologic markers like HDL levels are a biomarker that, the higher they are, the better it is for you. And optimism may enhance some of these positive biologic factors. And at the same time, optimism may decrease some negative biologic factors like inflammation. So that through this entire process, decreased stress, improved health behaviors, decreased bad health behaviors, as well as improved biologic function and less emphasis on the negative aspects of biologic function. You can end up truly with a large picture of how optimism can influence longevity, well-being, and health and aging. And as we go through, I'm actually going to show you strong scientific evidence of how optimism truly influences each of these different factors. I will talk also about some of the obvious complexity here. I'm sure some of you are already wondering. So the way I have posed it so far, optimism causes good health. And that is, kind of the underlying notion. But clearly, there are many other ways to think about it, which is where the complexity begins to be introduced. So it could, in fact, work in the reverse direction. And evidence we see that optimism appears to lead to better health. Maybe it's actually simply what we call in research reverse causality. So it's not that optimism causes good health, it's that actually good health causes optimism. And people who are sicker or exercise less or have a worse diet become more pessimistic or less optimistic. So you can very easily see here how it would be pretty complicated to do research which can establish that optimism causes good health as opposed to the reverse, that in fact bad health decreases our levels of optimism. There is certainly a whole, another option as well, that any relationship we see between optimism and good health might just be completely false and due to some third factor, maybe the same genetic factors which lead to optimism, also happen to lead to good health, and that there's no true relation between optimism and health, but there's just some third factor that happens to cause both of them. So again, all kinds of pictures going on, making it fairly complex to determine a true causal relationship between optimism leading to health. So I'm also going to talk about some of the ways we try in population science to understand these issues and to address them so that we can determine if perhaps changing individuals' optimism or even society's level of optimism might lead to health and well-being. So just as a general picture, so as I said, we have this underlying premise that optimism leads to better health in aging. There is a lot of complexity in trying to understand, does optimism actually cause good health, or is it the reverse, or actually neither? So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about ways in population science we try to approach this complexity from all different angles. So the things I'm going to go through are criteria which help us to determine that indeed optimism leads to good health. So one thing we try to do is use what we call longitudinal or prospective data. So if we first measure optimism people and then follow them over many years and look at their health, we feel a little bit more confident that the optimism is leading to good health and not the reverse, because we look at health many years later subsequent to determine people's optimism. So that can be one approach. We also try to identify mechanisms.
Sorry. This is the journalist who didn't show up.
So we can also look at mechanisms by which optimism may influence health. And again, we feel more comfortable if optimism influences mechanisms that then influence health. That also makes it feel like, well, that gives us more confidence that optimism truly does affect health. We also can look at optimism in different ways. And, for example, at the beginning, I showed you a number of related constructs, which aren't exactly optimism, but are similar. And if we see a lot of consistency, so if, purpose in life, life satisfaction, if all of these things seem to influence health, that makes us feel like the underlying construct probably is a reality. I'll talk a little bit about some of the statistical approaches, things we do like trying to adjust for confounders. So if optimism does go along with other things that may be good for you, can we try to sort of pull those factors out of the equation and still see if optimism is related to health? I'm going to show a little bit of kind of interesting experimental approaches. So can we actually randomize people to be optimistic or not? And that is, in causality or even, complexity, if we randomize people to two different states and then some become healthier than others, that gives us the most confidence that what we're identifying is true. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ways we might be able to randomize people to different levels of optimism, in a completely sort of anonymous way. And then finally, a bit of an extension on the notion of sort of longitudinal prospective data. But can we track people across their life course? So looking at their levels of optimism in childhood and see if that's still related to their health when they're adults. Again, giving us some confidence that, if you're optimistic as a child and healthy as an adult, that it truly does go in that direction, and that it's not your health which is causing your optimism. So this is, just a notion of all the things I'm going to do in the next sort of 15 or so minutes. So, just to begin and thinking about the data itself, so this is a review that was done, which actually identified 85 different studies, which all identified relationships between optimism and some aspect of physical health, ranging from blood pressure to coronary heart disease. Some of these, although not all, were, prospective studies where follow-up was maintained between measuring optimism and measuring health. And just quickly, I'm going to give you two examples. So this was a study that was done on optimism and coronary heart disease. It was done in about 1,000 men who were part of the normative aging study. This study had 10 years of follow-up. So among these men, optimism was measured, and then their health was followed over the next 10 years. And even after controlling for confounders or other things related to both optimism and health, there was a clear relationship, again, even over the course of 10 years, between the initial level of optimism and their risk of developing coronary heart disease. So that if you go from the pessimist to kind of neutral to the optimist, there were significant decreases in the percentage of those who developed coronary heart disease over 10 years. This is a study that was done actually in our nurses' health study. So this is 70,000 women with about 10 years of follow-up as well. So at baseline, we measured the women's level of optimism using the scale I showed you initially, and then we followed them for death over the next 10 years. And so these are showing, these are relative risks. So the people with the lowest level of optimism were considered baseline. And if we then looked, so these were the ones kind of with the lowest score on the optimism scale. And these are sort of increasing. So up to these are the ones with that sort of score of 24. And going from the least optimistic just to the next group, this 0.84 means about a 15% lower risk of mortality. And it's kept stepping right down. If we go to the next level of optimism, that was about a 25% lower risk of mortality. And for those with the highest level of optimism, 30% lower mortality rates than those who were the most pessimistic. So very solid endpoint, mortality, and 10 years of follow-up between assessing optimism and identifying their deaths. And again, taking into consideration even things like depression. So we did statistically control, for depression, for education, for other socio-demographic factors, and independently we found that level of optimism strongly influenced their subsequent mortality rates. So that's the kind of longitudinal or prospective data. We're going to move now to looking at some of the evidence on mechanisms by which optimism may work. So as I mentioned, we can think of mechanisms both as health behaviors as well as actual biologic function. And as I mentioned again, health behaviors range from things like cigarette smoking, physical activity, sleep quality, even kind of health screening factors like getting your cholesterol levels checked. And biologic function from things like sort of blood pressure, lipids, antioxidant levels. I'm going to actually show you some of the exact examples. So this is data from the Women's Health Initiative, where they actually intervened on people's diet. So they assigned people to have a healthy diet or a normal diet. And they also looked at their levels of optimism. So this was at baseline. These were the people who were assigned to have a healthy diet. And this is their diet score, with the higher score meaning a healthier diet. And these were the people who were assigned to not have a healthy diet. And this is just before they were instructed to change their diet. And you can see within both of these groups, increasing optimism means increasingly healthy diet. This now is what happened after the intervention. So this group were all given lessons for improving their diet, and this group was just told to maintain a regular diet. And then, by optimism level, the study looked at how their diet changed after they were instructed how to have a better diet. And again, whether it was the intervention group or the control group, the most optimistic people had the best improvements in their diet. So a mechanism by which optimism can influence health, it clearly has an influence on how we are able to eat. This is some biologic data. So looking at, this is antioxidant levels in blood, and this is levels of HDL cholesterol. And again, you can see clearly that less antioxidants in people with less optimism, more antioxidants in blood of people with more optimism, and the same thing for HDL levels. This is inflammatory processes, so now on the negative side of biologic function, looking over time at people with low optimism, medium optimism, and high optimism. And you can see the more optimistic they are at all these points in time, the lower their levels of inflammation. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the consistency and coherence. And I'm going to show this and the next slide are just two studies of similar but not quite identical constructs. So this is self-regulation. It's another positive behavior, how people are able to respond to bad things happening in their life. And this shows that people who have the least self-regulation, this steep line means that they are getting heart disease more quickly over time, compared to the people who have the most self-regulation are getting heart disease much less. And this shows life satisfaction, so asking people a simple question about how satisfied they are with their life, and then looking at all these preventive behaviors. So just quickly, all these numbers above 1 means the people who say they have more life satisfaction are more likely to practice all of these various screening behaviors. So another sort of mechanism by which optimism can eventually influence our life and health. I'm going to talk quickly about experimental approaches actually to change people's level of optimism. Optimism is, it's about 50% or so heritable, but that means it still is relatively changeable. And there actually are ways to change people's levels of optimism from behavioral kind of therapies, such as asking people to write down and envision their best possible selves, like how their life and how themselves could be best. And if you ask people to write that down repeatedly, it does actually help them try to become sort of their best self. There are actually some simpler measures that have been identified. For example, asking people every night to write down 3 things they're grateful for. And if you ask people to do that repeatedly, you actually can measure over time that their optimism increases as well. So there are actually some relatively simple interventions you can use to improve people's level of optimism. So this is actually a study was done on 3 groups, looking at relaxation response, or people's ability to maintain their optimism. So this was a group who had done yoga or meditation for long periods of time. This was a group who was assigned to just start doing yoga for 8 weeks. And then there was a control group. They actually took people's blood of those 3 groups and looked at gene expression. And they found, so between the long-term yoga practitioners and the control group, they found some significant differences in how their genes were expressed. They also found differences even between the shorter-term yoga group and the control group. And they also found, they looked in particular at the overlap. So differences in gene expression from this group that were similar in people who both did yoga for the long term as well as only for 2 months. And it turned out that these differences in gene expression that were common to the long-term and the short-term yoga groups were gene expression factors that have to do with responding to stress. So very clear evidence that things which can induce relaxation can actually biologically change the way we respond to stress. So now I've got a little bit of data on actually childhood optimism and long-term health. So I'm going to go to the second one, because I still have a few more slides and only a few more minutes, and actually some really interesting last slides. So this actually looks at positive factors in childhood, ranging from children's ability to regulate their ability to pay attention to things, to simpler things like a positive home environment in childhood. And these children, this was actually a study in Scandinavia, were then followed into adulthood. It was about 3,000 children who were truly followed throughout their life. And then what they looked at, we're going to kind of focus on this column here. What was looked at was how these childhood factors related to the cardiovascular risk profile in adulthood. So just as an example, a positive home environment as a child, this meant that as an adult, they were 30% more likely to have good cardiovascular health. And this was true, so all of these numbers indicate that, more positive attention regulation, more positive cognitive ability led to, as an adult, having more positive cardiovascular health. So intriguing suggestion that, we can have interventions starting, in young people as well as in adults. And if we can improve people's environment, we actually could have significant impact on their health, even many years later. So I just wanted to finish up by adding more complexity to the picture. So you may have wondered when I showed you that initial slide about those 6 simple questions which allow us to measure people's level of optimism. And you have to think, well, that's a pretty crude way of measuring something so complex like optimism or attitude. And that, if we could do a better job measuring, sort of the richness or the complexity of people's attitudes and behaviors, maybe we actually could do a better job of understanding, how to change them or how to maintain them. So there's been some really interesting work done, just in the last literally months and years, on trying to find better ways of measuring people's behavior. Because we also obviously have the concern, once people know we're trying to measure their behavior, will they lie a little bit, or will they respond in ways they think we want them to respond? Everyone probably wants to think they're more optimistic than they really are. So just by virtue of formally measuring it in someone, you may elicit responses that are not actually, valid of their true level of optimism. So, the complexity of optimism can be hard to measure in a short scale, and our ability to measure it, may be hindered, by people's beliefs and attitudes. And in addition, in order to, administer surveys to people, you have to find people, you have to, track them for years and years. It's expensive and it's burdensome. So recently, there's been some research which starts to use social media as a way to measure people's attitudes. So I just, copied here. These are our two recent publications where researchers have gotten permission to go. So one of them is based on, one of them is from Facebook, and one is using Twitter. So the researchers actually get permission to go into people's Facebook pages or go into their Twitter accounts, and they use sort of more sophisticated techniques called natural language processing, where the computer can actually read and identify different types of words. So they use natural language processing to go into people's Facebook pages or their Twitter accounts and identify the kinds of words they use. So you can identify, sort of more positive words, and you can identify more negative words. And, as an example, in this study using Twitter to identify people's psychological well-being, they actually were able to identify that sort of in areas where people's Twitter accounts had more positive words, there also was less mortality due to heart disease. And this is a whole field which is really, really, truly in its infancy. But, as you can, even just start to imagine, really holds, incredible excitement and promise for finding actually relatively simple ways of measuring people's attitudes, behaviors, and then seeing, what influence that might have on their health. So just to quickly sum up, so, optimism and other aspects of psychological well-being are potentially, very exciting and novel approaches for trying to improve people's health as we age. There are certainly, a growing body of data supporting the benefits of optimism, but, there is a lot of complexity in measuring it and also in investigating it. But there is hope that we can actually take advantage of the complexity of the data out there to help us learn a lot more and point to ways to improve people's well-being and also to improve their health. Thanks.